My name is Dave Mayer. I am the founder of Technical Integrity, and I'm a passionate community builder. Been active in the Boulder, Denver community, as well as rural communities in Colorado, bringing people together in events like this, as well as obviously in person. Year 2 original organizer for Boulder Startup Week, same for Denver Startup Week. My day job is building executive engineering and sales teams with an emphasis on diversity and culture fit. I have been fortunate enough to become friends with Brad through the years. I've done a ton of work for Foundry Group and Techstars companies, and grateful for Wendy joining us today as well. Wendy, you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Wendy Lea, honored to be here. I'm an entrepreneur, board member, angel investor, and most recently learned a lot about ecosystem building, both through my work at Techstars, but mainly through my work in Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and Southeast Indiana. So this effort that I've had a chance to participate in with Brad in the last couple of weeks has been extraordinary and exciting. And for all of us, we have a part to play to get the message out, not just to our own companies, but those in our community, so we can maneuver through the crisis and get to a new stage of, reboot and growth again. So thanks for having me, Dave. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Brad, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Brad Feld, partner of Foundry Group, co-founder of Techstars. I have been very involved the last 3-4 weeks in a number of initiatives on the private side in support of a bunch of the activities going on around the COVID crisis and trying to help in any way I can. There's plenty of linkages with various state level stuff on that and sort of advisory roles. But I've been pretty amazed at the volunteer engagement and the number of people that have both spun up as leaders, doers, and just engaging in a bunch of different things that I would say from a leadership level are moderately organized. One of my approaches to this has been to get a bunch of people like Wendy, who are CEOs, involved in leading different things that have come up that need help. And in an organized fashion, I think there's probably over 300 people that are engaged in one way or another in a couple of the different efforts. And then there's many, many more that have done things, and we can talk about some specifics that literally organically generated within a week that had very meaningful impact on both, for example, healthcare workers on the front lines of the COVID crisis that are the caregivers, and on the other end, restaurants that are all struggling with their own economic devastation because of stay at home and being closed, and figuring out ways to help both of those constituencies structurally while helping each other. So just a lot of stuff like that that's come out of their creativity of a bunch of people, and it's been pretty awesome. I should also say that I'm purpose-built for stay at home. I don't think I've ever leaving my house again, so I don't like to go outside in public anyway, so here we are. It's nice to see that the rest of the world has decided that video conferencing is a good way to communicate. It's unfortunate that it required a public health crisis to do that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. Grateful for you, Brad and Wendy, and for everybody else, and for your interests. And I will apologize in advance. I don't know that I've shaved in roughly 742 days, so sorry about that. So why don't we sort of dive in? I think obviously there's a lot of folks who want to know, how to save their businesses, how to really navigate these unparalleled times, and maybe we can start with a softball, but a loaded question around, what are the lessons learned from the past few recessions and that you both have been through, Wendy and Brad, and how do we apply those today?
Let me start with a framing that I've been using for people to think about what we're going through, and then maybe let Wendy dive in with some specifics. We're going through three crises that are interrelated versus a single crisis. And it's unique how these three crises are unfolding globally, certainly in the United States. I'm in my mid-50s, and I think you have to be about 110 years old to actually have experienced a health crisis that's comparable to the health crisis we're in right now, which would have been the 1918 Spanish flu. For those of you in your 50s, probably the most significant other sort of broad health crisis that we've had in the US was HIV/AIDS. But very, very different dynamics because of it being a difficult to transmit virus, even though at the beginning it was incredibly mysterious. Nobody really understood it. And I was in college at the time, so it was an incredibly formative period of time. But we start with this health crisis that's global, with very little certainty about how to resolve the health part of the crisis. I think most people on this call know that stay at home is not a solution. It's literally a way to slow the spread, flatten the curve, whatever language we want to use, so that we can get ahead of what is this epidemic level crisis on the health side. I'm not a predictor, and I'm not going to prognosticate about what I think is going to happen. I think all of my friends in the venture capital world have become armchair epidemiologists in the last 30 days. I don't find that to be productive, particularly helpful. I've learned an enormous amount of stuff that I didn't know. So I have hypotheses and some frames of reference. Some of them that, surprised me as I got to understand them better. But interestingly, it's really important to start from the frame of reference of we are in a health crisis, and the health crisis we're in is probably going to last for a long time. It's not something that's just going to be solved in a month or two. The sort of time frames that people talk about are 6 to 18 months. Don't know where, but I think that's a reasonable framing, at least to think about. So that's crisis one. That crisis generated an economic crisis. In the absence of the healthcare crisis or health crisis, we wouldn't have an economic crisis. We had a very strong economy 45 days ago. This is a very interesting thing that coming out of 2019, we have investments in 80 some odd companies. Like, everybody printed their 2020 plan. Like, this is my plan. This is the growth that I've got. This is where we're going. And, by mid-March, in some of those companies by end of February, but by mid-March, everybody had just thrown those plans away, just trashed them. It's not even like worth iterating on the plan. It's not right. There's some companies that, their revenue went from extremely fast growing revenue to almost zero, right? If you're a company that depends on people traveling and people going to their office, you got no business. You'll have a business in the future, but you have no business now. Interestingly, there are other companies at the other end of the spectrum that have benefited from this crisis, right? Telemedicine, I think, is seeing not just unprecedented activity, unprecedented competition, but unprecedented acceptance. You think about video conferencing as maybe an edge case, but there's a bunch in that category of companies that are actually benefiting from this. And then there's a lot in the middle where there's an enormous amount of uncertainty about what's going on. Now, companies at the bottom of that, not just venture backed, but any kind of company. If you're a restaurant, you're in a pretty rough shape right now. If you're a hotel, you're in pretty rough shape right now. If you're an airline, you're in pretty rough shape right now. Like, you go down the list of all of these companies, large and small, that this financial or economic crisis is really, really dramatically impacting. But it's worth kind of coming back to, in the absence of the health crisis, the financial crisis wouldn't exist. And then the third crisis is one which is really challenging for us as a society, which is a mental health crisis. And I bounced around on the phraseology of that for a while. I was calling it situational adjustment crisis, because it really is that we're having to learn how to live our lives in different ways. But it is really, fundamentally, it's a mental health crisis. And it instantiates in lots and lots of different ways. Like, we're just not used to being in our houses all the time with our family. Or if you don't have a family and you're alone, you're not used to being alone in your house all the time and not having any other physical contact with anybody else. There's a whole bunch of dynamics that are particularly thorny. Domestic violence is a good example of one. You know, if you're in a relationship where there's domestic violence, or a family where there's any sort of domestic violence, it's very amplified in this dynamic, and there's no place to go, and there's no infrastructure to support you because everybody else is locked down. If you're a teacher, not only are you trying to teach your K through 12, you know, your ninth grade teacher, not only you're trying to do the remote teaching, which you're not used to doing. If you have kids, you have your kids at home. If you have, you know, spouse, you have your spouse at home. You're trying to balance all these things. This generates an enormous amount of pressure. And these three things are interlinked. And the reason I lead with that is that I think there's a little too much focus from certain sectors, especially in business, on the financial crisis aspect of it in isolation. I think the financial crisis or economic crisis is extreme, and so that's significant, but it is intermingled with these other two things. And really, for the first time that I've ever heard of, being the financial crisis itself is not driven by some sort of financial structural thing, but is actually being driven by a health crisis. So I'll pause with that. Wendy, you want to toss in a couple of tactical things from your experience, and since we're both old enough to have suffered through this a couple of times?
You're a youthful mid-50s and I'm a youthful mid-60s. So all good. We have plenty of experience. Where I go first in any of these conversations, one-on-one or in a large one-to-many opportunity like this, is when did we last as humans have a major level of instability in our system as a human, right? It could be a death of a parent, you know, any kind of loss. When your system, your baseline system, all of a sudden changes, everything about you starts circulating. And as we think about our future now, I think the first place we start is with ourselves and what is going on inside ourselves. And even if, using Brad's narrative about you're alone, or, you know, at home alone, or you're running both your children at home and your business at home, no matter your circumstance, it all starts with who you are first and how you are personally reacting to this lack of certainty about everything. The lack of certainty relative to health, the lack of certainty relative to your business, the lack of certainty relative to, you know, your holidays. It doesn't even matter to mention. I think stopping and saying, how am I operating, orienting, sensing the lack of certainty? Because without that stabilization, which is not even a word, Brad and I have talked about this, that I use, I can't even say it at the time. I can't even get it in my head. But without stabilizing self, I think all this nonsense is just going to continue to spiral that we're experiencing. And so I would start there. Tactical or strategic, I think it starts with you as an individual. And then, of course, it goes to all the other roles you have. And there are many. I've got many faces of Eve, many roles I play, from mentor to Aunt Wendy to neighbor, you know, you name it. And I think that's what is so hard to rock, though, right? Especially if you suck up any news, which is can't do it anymore, right? Or if you even try to read anything in your stream about what the feds are doing or the state's doing, or, you know, what Boulder is doing, it's so overwhelming. So I would just say, stop, figure out what you're doing, how you're feeling, how you can somehow get your arms around that, realizing there's not much else you can control. I know that's hard to accept, but there's not much else you can control. And it is a time for us to recognize that as we begin to parse through the hairball of crisis we face. This is not a one-lane traffic jam, right? It is not. It is the worst of the interstate system in LA or the East Coast. It's going like this and it's clogged up. So you have to stop and look at yourself first. That's what I would start with.
Appreciate it. Let's see if we can dig into some of these other questions. Brad, your take and Foundry Group's take on accepting these small business association grants from the government, especially the forgivable ones. I don't know if this is factually correct, but someone indicates that there was some concern around it might prevent a follow-on round dilution for the founders. Accurate, inaccurate, and where do you and Foundry Group stand on these forgivable loans in the small business realm?
Yeah, the conflict in future rounds, I don't know what that is. It doesn't make sense to me. So I don't think that's an issue.
Okay.
If you're curious, I wrote a blog post 2 days ago, I think, on Feld.com about this. My partner Seth Levine also wrote a blog post, and he's at SethLevine.com. And in it, we spent a fair amount of time talking about, each of us talking about our own points of view on it. And we published a letter, an email that we sent out to all of our portfolio companies last Friday. And what you'll see in the letter is a view that there are some companies that the PPP loans are relevant for. There are some that they are not, and there are some that it is ambiguous. And for each company, rather than simply view it as access to additional capital, they should first decide whether or not they are really a company that qualifies for the loan. And of course, like so many things, especially things that are rushed out by the government, the parameters that determine whether you qualify are quite ambiguous. The dynamics around it, though, are that the loans themselves have two parts to it. One is it's a loan. So for companies that are impacted by the current situation, and they don't define clearly what the current situation is, whether you're impacted directly by COVID or you're impacted indirectly by COVID because, you know, the economy has shut down. I think the general view is that it's the broader definition of you are impacted rather than the narrower definition. The forgiveness of the loan is linked to maintaining people on your payroll. So the intent of the forgiveness is that you would use the loan to keep people employed who otherwise wouldn't be. So sort of piece one is it's a loan, which is available to anybody who's impacted by this scenario. The forgiveness is linked to maintaining your payroll at the prior level and a formula associated with that. In our view, there are a lot of venture-backed companies, again, that are relevant targets for this loan, but there are plenty that aren't, right? If you're a $3 million a month ARR B2B SaaS business that has $50 million of cash in the bank, and in March you saw your net dollar retention go down from 130% to 110%, and your churn increased by 1 percentage point, the loan's not for you. Right? You're in solid financial position relative to where you're at. If you're a company that makes a hardware product and you can't get the product out of China because of the supply chain dynamics and the shipping dynamics, and therefore you can't sell your product, and your only two choices are, well, you could go out of business or you lay off a bunch of people or take the loan is targeted at you, especially if you can maintain some fraction of the payroll for some period of time. So there's a broad spectrum of the applicability here, and we've tried to encourage all of our companies. Well, we've encouraged all of our companies to have a formal thought process. I think in almost all cases, if not all cases, there's a written memo, presentation to the board, lawyers on the board, sort of walking through the rationale for why you're applying for this loan versus just, oh, the loan's available, fill out a form, apply. I saw a note in the Slack channel go by about applicability to VC-backed funds and PE majority-owned companies. They're very different things, and the nuance of those different things is going to get probably lost in the soup of all of this. And it was part of the problem with all the rules after the stimulus package was created about this notion of affiliates and who actually controls the company and whether an investor controls the company and how all that works. I feel like the rules, which change every day still, have gotten a lot clearer. And I would suggest that if you separate VC and PE companies, where VC-backed companies, the investor is a minority investor, tends not to control the company. PE-backed companies tend to be majority owned or controlled by the PE firm. I would argue that most PE-backed companies don't qualify because of the dynamics around that. But many VC companies do qualify. Independent of all of that, there's still I would say there's a legal, intellectual, financial, and ethical and moral discussion around this. There's a legal discussion that's fairly, not cut and dry, but it's fairly bounded. There's an intellectual discussion. There's a lot of people who don't believe that companies that are backed by risk capital should necessarily get dollars from the government in a situation like this versus all the other companies in the world that are not backed by risk capital and are self-funded businesses or cash flow-based businesses. There's an intellectual discussion that should be applicable, intellectual discussion around that. There's an ethical discussion, which is about taking government money in the first place. And the dynamics of which companies should and should not take money from the government, because you're essentially taking taxpayer money. If it's just a loan, somewhat different nuance there than the forgiveness of the loan, which is then a grant, and making sure that that rolls through. And then the last is moral, which is that people have very different perspectives, separate from ethical, about their own views of how one should operate in this moment in time. All of that said, I think one of the conclusions is rational people can disagree. And that's why it's so important that it be a company by company decision. I've heard, some firms say every company in our portfolio should take this, and if you don't take it, you're stupid. I've heard other firms say, we don't think that venture-backed companies should take this, and we're going to say no to all our companies. I don't think that incorporates the nuance of the reality of the situation and the goal of, at least the high-level goal of the PPP loans. Last comment to make on it. I don't know if anybody here is involved in a business that has applied. The actual process right now is a mess. And it's a mess because, the magnitude of money being pushed out by the U.S. government through the SBA, is thousands of times more than the SBA processes on a typical basis. And the rules around it were particularly challenging, or the allocation was particularly challenging for any sort of phased rollout, which was first come, first serve. And so it created this incredible demand bubble on the front end where everybody felt like they had to be the first in line or else the money was going to run out. And we're living in the second order effect of that kind of a dynamic, which is to make it even harder to get capital out to people. So it is, complicated on a bunch of places, including the actual downstream implementation of it.
A thought, Brad and Dave, on the community side, and this is based on real-time work we're doing here in Colorado. I have been very excited to hear about different ways other than through PPP or some of the other programs coming down from the SBA and other federal programs, creative ideas of amassing capital for different kinds of businesses. And it's very exciting to see that. And we're working on one opportunity right now that we only created like 3 weeks ago or 2.5 weeks ago. And it was an idea that really was sitting in a certain part of Colorado where there was access to some foundation money and there was access to some community banks that could actually distribute the money. And could we match what we could find with other philanthropic efforts or high net worth efforts? And it may be that we pull together up, 25 to 50 million, which I know is not going to solve the world's problems, but it may solve some very specific problems with a certain type of business that needs a grant or a loan. I only bring that up as an example that this is where community activation and connection to ecosystem leaders, and Carl, I saw your question about ecosystems. I think this is an opportunity in this crisis for new ideas to come forward that can quickly leverage existing structure, right? So you're not having to stand everything up from scratch. And I've been encouraged by that. And I would ask each of you in your own communities, what's happening there that would also provide some amounts of capital through grants or loans that could make a difference for a restaurant or an early stage startup or a nonprofit even, because all of those segments of our business are foundational to the futures of our communities and our cities and our states. So I've been encouraged by that, so I want you guys to be encouraged by it. It can be done.
I've got a question that was submitted in the past few days here. Obviously is interesting, should be interesting to everybody. At this time next year, when society and the economy have so hopefully normalized, what are the things you'll be looking for from entrepreneurs seeking capital as it relates to their 2020 business? Will you be looking for someone who stuck with it on their existing business plan, or will you be looking for someone who pivoted their business model to suit the market, or someone who did something different altogether?
I'll challenge just a little bit the use of the word normalized.
Yeah.
Because it informs my answer. I don't know that it's a safe assumption that we're going to be in some normalized dynamic at some point soon. I think it is equally likely that there will be some meaningful structural changes. I love Michelle's comment just now, a face mask will be like a seatbelt. I think there will be some foundational shifts in the way our society works, especially in the United States. Probably true around the world. I'm not going to speculate around the world, but certainly in the United States. But I don't really have a perspective on that yet. I could spin a bunch of hypotheses, but they have an equal probability of being right or wrong. As a result, I think that the dynamics of companies, when we look backwards, are going to be less about what somebody simply did in this moment, but it'll also incorporate how they did it. I think there's going to be a lot of companies that just by definition don't survive this experience. That's part of being in business. That's part of a crisis and a downturn. Doesn't feel good, but it's just part of it. There will be some companies that benefit because their products or services are ones that are really needed in this environment. In both of those cases, the big negative, the big positive, behaving gracefully is important. Being responsible and respectful of, if your business is in incredible distress, being as respectful and responsible as you can be to your employees, investors, customers, partners, while at the same time being pragmatic about your financial realities as a business. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'll use the example of N95 masks. There's an enormous amount of fraud, deceit, and opportunistic behavior going on. The cost of an N95 mask is about 50 cents. The retail price of an N95 mask, depending on where, is somewhere between 85 cents and $1. And when I say the cost, the fully landed cost, not the factory cost. The current number of offers that I have seen in my inbox from people who know a person who knows a person who can get me 1 million N95 masks for $4 a piece blows my fucking mind. And, you know, I didn't know what an N95 mask was 30 days ago. And that's an example of bad behavior in a moment in time where there's a crisis. there's very strong positive examples the other direction, of people who are recognizing that they are in the flow of something that can be incredibly helpful here. And instead of trying to make short-term money opportunistically on it, they may sell their product and service the same way they always do, but they're looking for ways to enable other people to be able to use their product and service against this crisis. An example I would give there that I'll call out is Slack. I think has done a really, really good job of making their product available for free, not indefinitely, but for the first 90 days, and that might get extended again in 90 days, to basically any nonprofit that's doing anything around this crisis. And I just had an experiment that's being worked on that would require the HIPAA version of Slack, not for me, but for another organization that's a HIPAA compliant provider, and Slack provided it for free for the experiment to see if it worked. I mean, they could say, no, you have to pay us per subscriber. Blah, blah, blah. So like even companies on the other end of the spectrum that are benefiting from it, how they behave in this moment is so important. Again, the ones in the middle is really hard because the ones in the middle are probably fighting for their lives to survive, are not necessarily benefited from this crisis. The crisis doesn't necessarily put them out of business. And those are the ones in some ways the question applies to. And for me, I think how those founders treat people, how those founders do their best to navigate through things on the other side of this will have, a lot of impact on certainly me as an investor in terms of how I think about them.
Indeed.
One thing that comes to mind is this paradox of I have to be completely pragmatic. Cash is king, and it is. And there are facts around all of this. There are the facts where I only have so much runway. I can only support N number of employees to serve N number of customers, and just staying on that side of the street, so to speak, just the facts, and then realizing the dimension that also surrounds those facts, which is we don't know how long these facts are going to go for. We can't really predict that. There is a level of uncertainty and unpredictable and being unpredictable about where these circumstances go. When are we going to be able to open? So I think that, Brad, if I were one of your CEOs or one of your board colleagues, I think it's finding that middle ground, which is not ground that most people like, of getting solid with the facts about where we are, and then realizing that there's no pure, clear future state, to really orient for. And as an entrepreneur, that's what we like, right? We have this round, it's going to last 18 months. And we're going to know early because we don't have product market fit. So we're going to go back to you and say, that was a stupid idea. I'm out. It's screwed. You need to be out too. But it's that, moving through it gracefully or not, because you do have some facts, how much money you have, how many employees you have, how many customers you have. Yet I feel nervous sometimes for our entrepreneurs and myself about, well, how much is that really true? Because really every day you have to look at it. And then that makes you crazy because you're having to look at it every day. But I think it's that ambiguity of the middle and the complete uncertainty of the future that's causing us to kind of really grow up fast. And that's not an age statement. That is a maturity statement. That is bringing forward everything you've learned and everything you've tucked away that you learned but you don't use, and bring it to the forefront. I think that's the difficult, those of you that are running either venture-backed businesses or bootstrap businesses, and you have customers and you have teams, I think that's the check-in, because you can get your arm around the facts. You can maybe get your arm around your own fear, your craziness, your anxieties. Maybe you can do that if you have your tools to do that. But you're going to have to constantly kind of muddle through, because there's not a clear North Star relative to the business environment. And that, I'll go back to another statement, Dave and Brad, and that is, that's the transformation that's happening. I think. And everyone wants to know, when are we going to open up? Are the kids going to go back to school first and then that will allow the parents to? Well, guess what? We don't know. And all the McKinsey people in the world crunching data from Wuhan and Italy and in their frameworks, and they're filled up and they're beautiful and they all seem to, like they make sense. They don't know either. And so we together alone, because that's what we are, we're together alone in our Slack calls and Zoom calls or whatever, are having to think through that day by day. And that's hard for humans. It's certainly hard for Americans. I'll speak for that which I know, because we really like to be aggressive with our targets and work backwards and then work like dogs to achieve our goals. And I don't think we have that available to us right now. So it takes a lot of strength and a lot of dedication and a lot of communication, internal communication, external communication. So you just don't go off the rails. Our job is not to go off the rails, right? And to help others around us not to go off the rails and to lead in any way you can, not just yourself and your companies, but your communities. So that would be my point of view.
Great.
I was going to clear a couple of questions, but my Zoom pad just crashed. So Dave, why don't you ask another question, then
Yep.
Let's go through, or maybe, I just came back. Let's clear a couple of the things that
That's a good idea.
have come up as questions, because I think there's a lot of good stuff in the chat. And I'm just going to go bottom to top quickly. So these will be quick hits. Alex says, if you find an all-consuming passion, it can help, as the North Star allows you to have something solid to hold on to. Totally, totally, totally true. And for me, in moments like this, what I found is that if I think of myself first, I get anxious. If I think of others first, I'm not anxious at all. And so for me, I take care of myself too, but I tend to focus on others first. And my overall anxiety then goes down, but I think right on. John says his crystal ball is in the shop, so is mine. Actually, mine's not in the shop, it's just fucking busted. James Dunn says, how do you find balance and focus with business development? I'm not sure what the with business development is, but balance and focus for me, sort of in the midst of this crisis, is I try to do a couple of things for myself every day. I meditate every day. It's something I've been doing for a long time, so it's just part of my routine. I'm very aware of it because I tend to spend more time, like instead of doing a 15 or 20-minute session, I'll do a 30-minute session. I'm doing one of these a day. I've kind of committed to myself to do a public-facing thing once a day for an hour every day. If you did it rationally from time allocation, I don't have time to do this. But this feels good to me. I enjoy doing this. I learn a lot from the questions. I learn a lot from the interactions, and it feeds me. Hopefully it's useful to y'all. But for me, it's a very selfish activity. It's sort of along that line, because it is a chance for me to do something that I get some real pleasure from. So trying to weave some of those things in throughout an otherwise very disorienting, I think for many people, kind of experience, to never leave the house, to always be with your family, to not have, kind of going out in our normal patterns. Carl Brackpole says, interesting tangent, not to be predatory or opportunistic, but if we're splitting our energy between surviving the present and looking forward to recovery in the shortest time frame, do you see a huge wave of startups in material science, additive manufacturing, sudden retool for addressing hardware requirements in a crisis? Absolutely. I mean, in any crisis, there's an enormous number of business opportunities. And one of the things that a crisis like this, especially given how multifaceted it is, can do is cause us as people to slow down and think hard about what we really want to spend our time on versus just continuing to do the same thing. And that's true in all aspects of life, including the commercial aspects or the entrepreneurial aspects of our life. So I would emphasize that there are numerous things that are opportunities. And if you're an existing business that you see something like that is tangential, pivoting towards it or moving towards it's logical. And if you're not in an existing company today, looking at the opportunity space that's emergent is really stimulating. And then last one before we go back to regular questions. Actually, Michelle said, I love the open source 3D printing for masks that I posted recently. That's a organization, nonprofit called Make 4, the number 4 COVID. It's Colorado based. It's now got over 1,000 makers involved in it. It's awesome. And it's come together in 3 or 4 weeks. Super impressive example of just a group of people that organized, were inclusive, and continue to let that spin outward and iterate very rapidly on things and find things that they could make with 3D printers at home, non-industrial grade 3D printers that could be really helpful immediately in this crisis. Let's go back to Dave.
Yep. So one of the ones up top in the chat is, what are you seeing with regards to office culture moving to virtual? Are companies going to permanently shift to virtual? Will they rush back to the office? Something in the middle? And how do you decide as a business what the right answer is?
Just, I would love a quick comment on that. I think, well, if you've looked at the data around our carbon footprint going down over the last 3 weeks, based on where this virus has gone and the shutdowns, you know, led by political, you know, governments, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. The fact that that carbon footprint can be so favorably influenced so fast by us not getting in our cars or whatever creates that problem. So my personal opinion is that finding these new rituals and practices around work is the future of work. The fact that there are technology tools that allow us to leverage it, okay, that's awesome too. So thanks to Stuart and all the folks, you know, that have created these tools. But I don't think we'll go back, and I don't want us to have to go back to get up, dress up, get in a car, commute, waste, come home, drop off your kids. I just think that's not the way we're supposed to be living anymore. I know it's hard when you're all clustered and shut down in a house. I sense that, and I see that through my friends, but I think this is going to be the new way. And think about it practically. If you are a venture-backed business, I know in San Francisco, when I led a couple of them, how much I paid for rent. I mean, that number is extraordinary. You know, I could have hired more engineers or more marketing people or more salespeople, but no, I was convinced in my head that I had to have a very cool space in, you know, in Soma, and it cost me a fortune. And that's where culture emanated from. Now, maybe that's where culture emanates from, but it's an element. But I do think this is going to have a positive impact on our global climate crisis, and I think we will adapt, and we will find that this is the way we're going to work, distributed and in home spaces. So Brad, I don't know how you feel about it as a venture investor, looking at the line items your CEOs invest in space, real estate, commercial real estate. I'd love to hear your point of view.
Well, I'm personally never leaving my house again, so I have no need for an office. Look, historically there were a small number of fully remote scale tech companies, you know, there are some well-known ones like Automatic, which makes WordPress, and GitLab. You know, these companies are 1,000 people fully remote. And then, you know, there are very large technology companies that have distributed workforces, including plenty of people who work from home. Google is probably the best example of that in terms of over a long period of time with that kind of a culture from almost the beginning, but many others. Non-technology businesses generally didn't have that in their cultural norm. They might have multiple offices, you know, large multinational companies often did. There was this sort of hoteling phenomena, if people remember, where you didn't really have a desk, you sort of shared desks. There was also the sort of, you know, I would say lower strata of the organization tended to have work from home type options as a cost reducing measure in remote offices, but it wasn't really, sorry, I'm gonna close my doors. It wasn't really a norm in terms of work patterns. And even though video conferencing's been around for a long time, it wasn't particularly well enabled in terms of the other tools that we used. Not just the technology tools, but also the functional tools of how we communicate. This experience in 30 days has forced all of the human race to learn how to work remotely. So there's no longer a barrier. Like there's no longer a, well, we don't do it, we don't have the tools for it, everybody does. And so now it's more of a choice culturally for companies. There has been a huge move in the last decade to really almost 20 years now, but really in the last decade to reurbanization, right? The move back to cities, the move to business into the city core, entrepreneurial activity in the city core, globally, because people wanted to be near each other. And all of a sudden we're having this, not just experiment, but sort of global experience of the inverse of that. I don't know how that will stick in the end. I'll tell you that, my partners and I at Foundry Group have this conversation, not just tongue in cheek at this point. We have an office in downtown Boulder. We're being, we travel a lot, so there's rarely a full set of people in the office. Some of us like to work from home. I usually work from home a couple of days a week anyway. And all of a sudden the conversation is, why do we have an office? And as a, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 person company, I think that's going to be a lot more of a norm than it has historically. That also changes labor dynamics quite substantially. If the only people you can hire are people that are within driving distance of your office, the population of people that you can hire is quite limited. If all of a sudden you can hire people from anywhere, you're unconstrained on that dimension. And I think as, 6 weeks ago, unemployment in the United States was 2%. And there were unemployment in parts of the United States that was basically 0%. Today, unemployment is 20%. And, whether it's going to go to 40% or not is hard to tell. But let's say that unemployment could be as high, it's not quite 20% yet, but let's say unemployment could be 30 or 40%. There's a moment on the other side of this where unemployment could snap back very quickly to 10%, which is still recessionary. And there's still a lot of people looking for jobs. And so the flexibility of being able to have remote workforces will create a much, much more vibrant start to that versus workforces that are physically clustered. So I think that it's a long-term shift in how we work. But I don't think it's an either or. I think you can have one or the other. I think you can mix them, and I think they're going to be cultural dynamics by company and by employee. I think there's probably a lot of people who are sitting at home, working at home, that fucking hate it. Hate working at home. Hate not going to an office. Hate not being surrounded by their peers. Hate not having a social experience that comes with being in an office. And then there's others like me that would be perfectly happy never to go to the office and just see people on a pane of glass and interact with them that way and have that kind of an experience. So I think as a leader, if you're a business leader, like being flexible on those dimensions and embracing the opportunity to expand how you work is very powerful.
Awesome. Here's another one. Apart from extending runway or changing timelines, what specific changes should a startup make to their plans for finding, screening, and approaching investors in the next 6 months?
Well, 6 months is a weird time frame because it's really hard to know what the cycle is. We're encouraging all of our portfolio companies to try to put themselves in a position to not have to raise money again until mid to end of 2021. So we're telling people, give yourself at least 12 months of runway, and however you do that, you lay people off, you take PPP loans, you ask us for some additional capital, but put yourself in a position where you don't have a window of financing need basically rest of this year. What will happen is one of two things. It's important for people to know, if you're looking for venture-backed money, there's a lot of VC-based money available in venture funds. Some funds, and just today, Index announced they raised $2 billion across 2 funds. General Catalyst just announced they raised $2 billion. Somebody else announced last week that they raised $1.5 billion for their fund. I mean, these are big numbers for venture. And these are big funds. And there are many, many funds that have a lot of capital. We closed our last fund in the end of 2018. So really beginning of 2019 was when we started deploying it. It's a $750 million fund. And before this crisis, we were on pace where we would raise another fund in 2022. So, we have a lot of capital to invest, and, I'm not sure what our pace will be in terms of new investments from that. So probably it extends further than that. So know that there's a lot of capital. However, right now in this moment, there's plenty of VCs who say, hey, we're open for business. Most VCs right now are still deeply, deeply involved in working on their existing portfolios and trying to figure out what to do and how to do it and how to allocate capital to which companies and what companies should do. So there are not very many investors who are looking at new things. That will change, and it'll probably change reasonably quickly, but the question will be with what velocity and what you should do to set yourself up for that. The other thing that tends to happen in downturns is that a lot of investors behave very opportunistically, for better or for worse. They think, things are less expensive. They should be able to get better deals. And so if you're in a position where you have to raise capital versus you're in a position where you have a company that's working and you don't have to raise capital, but the capital comes to you, well, the second category is always better than the first category. And then the last comment I make on this is that a lot of early stage companies and non-venture backed companies raise money from angel investors and friends and family. And a lot of those angel investors are high net worth individuals. And it's worth noting that most people feel less high net worth than they did a month ago or 2 months ago. And when that happens, those investors tend to slow down, even if they have plenty of capital to invest, because they want to see what happens. And that's just a natural part of the cycles again. So short term, harder to find money. Not impossible, but harder. Medium term, very uncertain, because it depends a lot how this plays out. Longer term, reasonably optimistic that the wheels of commerce will continue. I saw Jim ask a question that I think is irrelevant to the end of this, which is, what are debt providers who partner with VC reacting to this environment? And I would say our experience at Foundry with the primary debt providers that our companies work with, SVB is by far the largest, but there are several others, has been generally very, very constructive. Not 100% of the time, but generally very constructive. SVB explicitly rolled out their own internal program where they shifted to interest-only payments for 6 months. So for many companies that were having to pay down loans that were outstanding, they shifted it so that it's interest only for the next 6 months. And then they tacked on 6 months to the end of the program. That's pretty impressive. Like that was a powerful move because they made it simple for companies to have a meaningful amount of payment relief from debt reduction. New loans, hard to get that are outside the PPP structure, just because there's so much noise in the system and so many people are so busy right now. That'll probably loosen up some for the venture lenders. I don't know how it's going to impact non-venture lenders across the system. Many of them, the ones that are SBA related, have huge amounts of loans that they're processing from that dimension. So my sense is that'll consume them for a while. But my own experience is that there has not been much inappropriate behavior from the debt community yet. Inappropriate subjective, I should say, not behavior that is not helpful to companies.
Wendy, did you want to weigh in on that specifically?
No, nothing else on that. I want to suggest we there are a couple of questions in the chat around ecosystems.
Sure.
And I know there are a lot of folks that I know on the call from the Midwest that are active in leading ecosystems or building ecosystems. And this is a subject Brad and I have not had a chance to discuss. And I think it would be fun for people and interesting for people to hear your point of view, Brad.
And I just want to do a time check too. We've been going for an hour. Dave, how long do you want to go for? I have about 15 minutes before I have to drop for something else. We good for another 15?
Let's call it 15. Great.
Okay.
So the question was around, given all the change and crisis, how will that impact current ecosystems and the building of future ones? How should we look at that differently? And as a co-founder of Techstars and an author around startup communities, I would love to hear your point of view on that.
Sure. So I have a new book coming out with a guy named Ian Hathaway. It'll come out this summer. It's called The Startup Community Way, and it's a sequel to Startup Communities. The title is an homage to Eric Ries and the Lean Startup, who wrote a book called The Startup Way as his sequel to the Lean Startup. And Eric gave me permission to pay him homage with the title. It is a sequel. I have a second edition of Startup Communities coming out as well. In the Startup Community Way, we use the framing of a complex adaptive system to describe how a startup community works. We abbreviate complex adaptive system to just complex system. And if you're familiar with complexity theory that came out of the Santa Fe Institute in the 1980s, 1990s, and sort of understand how it links back to sort of academically a number of different things, including a biological vector of how emergence works, along with things like systems dynamics, then what I'm going to say is redundant. If you don't know, the very short way to explain it is that there are generally three types of systems: simple, complicated, and complex. A simple system is one that has a single determinate answer. Do a thing in an order and an outcome occurs. Making a cup of coffee is a simple system. Making a piece of toast is a simple system. Think of a recipe. And many, many, many things we do in life and in business are simple systems. A complicated system is one that is basically like a simple system, but is much, 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 much more detailed. Oftentimes there are multiple paths to the answer, so you don't have to do the same thing the same way each time. But interestingly, there is a determinate outcome. Building an airplane is an example of that. It's complicated, but in the end, you have an airplane, and you can do it again and build another airplane that's just like the previous airplane. A complex system is one that doesn't have a determinate outcome. And in a complex system, you do a bunch of inputs. You have a bunch of inputs that generate outputs. Those outputs become inputs, which generate more outputs. And the dynamics of how that works is not controllable. You can't put a recipe or a formula against it. And it's one of the reasons why with ecosystem development, broadly writ, I think the idea of startup communities was so impactful or resonated so much, one of the reasons, because I didn't say, here's the recipe, here's how you build a startup community, here's how you build an entrepreneurial ecosystem. What I said in the book are, here are behaviors that if you adopt these behaviors, they will have outputs that will generate positive things over a long period of time. So Ian and I went super deep on complex systems when we had the aha that a startup community was a complex system. And the book uses that as the frame of reference extensively. And I'll tie that back to this moment in time. This crisis that we are in is a complex system. Remember at the beginning of the conversation, and anybody who's pedantic can be annoyed with me because Dave's asked a few questions that were very direct and I basically hedged. Right? I basically said, fuck, I don't know. And but I gave some texture around it, but I really don't know, because so many things affect what's going to happen. When can we stop sheltering in place? We could decide to stop sheltering in place tomorrow. And based on what I know, if we stopped tomorrow in many cities in the world, we would just see a rapid outbreak of coronavirus again. How effective are wearing masks? There's a lot of debate about how effective are wearing masks in public. But there's no question that there's some efficacy. And one of the things we're trying to do right now is significantly decrease the spread of the disease. So all of these are inputs. The behaviors are inputs that generate outputs. If the disease spread goes down, we have a chance to do different things. Our hospitals won't get overloaded. We don't need more ventilators. Healthcare workers don't all die. The healthcare workers aren't all completely worn out because there's not as many people showing up at the hospital. So many different layers of this complexity that are all unfolding at the same time and interrelated. I think that's the beauty of a startup community, and especially coming out of an environment like this. Startup communities came out of the financial crisis. I mean, that's really what generated the globalization of startup communities. The financial crisis was the end of a hierarchical model of business society. It was the end of top-down control. We always had a network model in the mix. There was always a lot of startup activity, but sort of post-internet bubble, that became very diffuse. And when the hierarchical top-down model in the financial crisis structurally collapsed for many industries and at a macro level, it created the opportunity for the network model to have much more influence. And that's what we've been playing out for the last 10 years. And I think that's what's going to play out for the next 10 years coming out of this crisis. And so many of the things that we do play into that. I'll just end with, Fred Wilson wrote a really good blog post yesterday on his blog at avc.com about the internet. And he was on a Zoom call and he was thinking, geez, the fidelity of this is so good. There's, 100 times, 1,000 times the number of people on the internet all day long doing video conferencing and remote school and all kinds of shit. And it's working. And it's working because it's a completely decentralized network system. It's not a single central standard control model. And that metaphor is one that I think is so powerful for startup communities.
A thing I would add to that, thanks, Brad, that was beautifully said and inspiring to me as an ecosystem builder, and I bet to Brian and Carl and others that are in the work. One thing I'm struck about right now is the fact that in an ecosystem, there are many nodes or segments and clusters of capability, from universities to governments, to startups, to small business, to nonprofits, and pulling all those together sometimes, there are just all kinds of cultural barriers and system barriers. And so many times ecosystem leaders, they just hunker down into the one thing they know versus continue to try to crack open all the nodes so the whole ecosystem can lift and be better than it was before. I think now it's a beautiful opportunity, exquisite opportunity, because all the barriers that used to be barriers are now more porous, because universities want to be helpful, and startups want to be helpful to small business, and small business wants to be helpful to nonprofits. And I don't mean in a kumbaya way. I think there's a real structural shift that can allow ecosystem builders to leverage now and bring people together in the spirit of the whole of the greater Cincinnati area or Erie or whatever the geographical bounds are, including Golden, Colorado. So I just want, if you're in that business or involved at all, I would say this is a very interesting time because everyone needs help. And it seems like there's this spirit of volunteering and being helpful. And around ecosystem development, that's what we need. And so you help yourself, put the mask on the airplane on yourself first so you can breathe before you can help others. But I do want to encourage you all to think of it that way. And our way of getting out is reaching out, right? Anyone can get a link to Zoom. So even though we can't go out, or we're not supposed to without a mask and all that on, you can reach out and you can get engaged, not just in your business and in your, your segment of the economy, but in others, and bring them together so we can impact change right now and get through this part of the crisis and get into a new phase of growth, or whatever we're going to call this new phase. So I really appreciate, Brad, you sharing those ideas and reminding me and others about the difference in complicated versus complex, because I know that's true based on my own experience. So Dave, that was fun.
Thank you all. I am super grateful, Wendy and Brad. Thank you for all the participants. It was awesome to get this up to 75 people. Obviously, it'll be reaching a lot more. This is being recorded, as you know. We will share it on technicalintegrity.com, and we'll share it through Wendy and Brad as well. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Obviously, there's a lot to cover here, and we can leave it with, I think John Mansfield said it best. We can adopt the Japanese bowing ceremony, no more shaking hands. So thank you, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. Super grateful for you all.
Okay.
Everybody be safe and be healthy.
Yeah.
Be safe, be healthy.
Be well. Cheers.
Cheers.